Welcome to the recordings of the Microsoft Australia OEM 2015 Server Roadshow. These are based on the slides that were delivered at the series of events that were delivered across 22 locations in Australia in the first half of FY15. So let's jump in first of all and set the stage for some of the content we'll be talking about and the changes that have been occurring in the market that lead to these conversations. So let's jump in and talk a bit about the partner opportunity. So what we've got here is really over the last 10, 15, 20 years, we've seen quite a few changes in terms of what's been happening in the PC marketplace. We've been through the PC era where the mission statement for companies like Microsoft was around getting a PC onto every desktop. And that's something that in most organizations has really been something that has been achieved for quite a while now. Over time, though, things like internet connectivity started creeping in, where we started seeing that there were different opportunities available to partners. So you had the ability to start connecting things to each other, but also now to connecting them out to the internet. So all of a sudden, there were different services, there were different hardware platforms you could start enabling to start allowing your users to securely connect to the resources that the internet provided. Now, as we've moved across to the cloud era, probably the most important thing here is that in a lot of ways it's been a natural transition in some cases from internet services that we may have been using in the past to moving across now to where we've got a lot more subscription services being made available to customers. So some of these subscription services may be things that the customer just couldn't have really afforded in an on-premise deployment perspective. It may have been the types of solutions that just weren't available to customers of all sizes in the past. So what we've got now as we move across to the cloud era is a lot of flexibility in terms of what we keep deploying on premise and how we choose to integrate that with the cloud, and then what cloud services we do choose to take advantage of there. So what are some of these different cloud services that we can take advantage of? Well, when Microsoft went out and did some research with one of their research partners, these were some of the numbers that they received in terms of the overall interest in different technologies around virtualization and moving to the cloud. And as you can see here is, like, while there's still going to be growth in servers, as we start taking a look at some of the other options such as hosted servers, this is really where we start seeing some large growth areas. But you'll also see, though, that from a virtualization perspective, things like desktop virtualization, server virtualization, as well as storage virtualization are all very important. Now, the first two, desktop virtualization and server virtualization, well, these are things we've been doing to a degree for a while now. So with desktop virtualization, for many of us, this may have been deploying remote desktop services, or prior to that, terminal services into a lot of our customers. But now, we can start taking a look at some of the different options, such as, do we look at some of the capabilities around remote app that Windows Server 2012 R2 provides? As we take a look at server virtualization, perhaps the most important thing here is that this is something that, even though we tend to think that it's really out there and that everyone's using it, you can see here that over on the left-hand side in the small business column, that server virtualization is still quite at a low percentage. So there's still a lot of room for growth here. The inclusion of Hyper-V Server inside of Windows Server 2012 R2 makes it a very easy decision for a lot of customers to go down that path. But you can even see that over on the mid-sized business, there is still a lot of room for growth when it comes to deploying server virtualization technologies. Now, finally, as we move to storage virtualization, this is something that means different things to different people, depending on whether it's a software vendor or a hardware vendor who's positioning this to you or to your customers. But really, it's all about starting to just extend the amount of storage that's available to the customer, or presenting the storage in different ways based on the customer's requirements. So in some cases, when people talk about storage virtualization, they may be talking about natively extending things out to the cloud and working from there. Or they may be talking about the way they can start presenting storage in different ways inside of their organization, in very different ways to how that storage has been made available. And these are topics that we'll cover in more detail as we go through the additional recordings in these sessions. So let's jump in now and we'll talk about how to buy and license Windows Server 2012 R2. So perhaps some of the biggest changes that we had when we moved from Windows Server 2008 R2 up to Server 2012 and 2012 R2 was that the Enterprise Edition of Windows Server disappeared. But now we've only got we've got the standard and the data center, but the big difference here is that now Standard includes all of the technologies and capabilities that Data Center also provides. Whereas in the past, customers who were looking at clustering or some of the other high performance networking capabilities may have needed to go down the enterprise or data center path just to get those capabilities. So these are now things that are being delivered straight within the Standard product as well as Data Center. And what really determines which way you should go is really based on the number of virtual machines the customer is planning on running. So generally, if they only need one or two VMs, then Standard is going to be probably the smarter option for them. But as soon as they are talking about a much more complex virtualization deployment, then all of a sudden Data Center with its unlimited virtual instances capabilities does start to make a lot more sense. Now, with both Standard and Data Center, these are licensed on a per processor, per two processors plus CALs. So in most SMB environments, it being based on two physical processors per license isn't really that much of an issue. But just important to note, though, that there are no CALs included, so that for each server that you are purchasing, you will need to make sure you do have the appropriate number of CALs for the customer in that environment. As we move on to the next two, we've got Essentials and Foundation. Now, these are both seen as, I guess, the entry-level versions of Windows Server. So with Foundation Server, it really is a limited purpose server. It doesn't include the Essentials capabilities that gives you integration with tools such as Office 365. So for people who really do need a very small, cheap Windows Server-based solution, Foundation may be a good option, but generally I'd be steering people towards Essentials as the starting point because they do start getting a lot more functionality right in the box with that, and you also do get a 25 user limit included with that versus the 15 users that are included with Foundation. So with these, it's important to note that the 25 users or the 15 users are built in, so they are included as part of the license. So you don't need to buy CALs when you are using Essentials or Foundation. So these are some of the features that we'll go into more details of in some of the other sessions that are being recorded for these events. So if we take a look here, you'll see that really we've got 6 main categories here. We've got scalability and performance, which includes compute improvements, network improvements, and storage improvements. We've got availability improvements around live migration. We've got disaster recovery capabilities that were introduced with Windows Server 2012 and enhanced with 2012 R2 with the Hyper-V replica capabilities. Now, we've also got simplified management through the Server Manager console, which is an important part, and you'll see that we've recorded a demonstration that covers that in a lot more detail. When it comes to storage, this is really where Microsoft is re-entering the storage space after, I guess, a lot of people have been looking at what Microsoft's been doing with storage, and they haven't really done a lot with storage for a while. They have had the storage server products, which have been, an altered version of Windows Server. But now with Windows Server 2012 and 2012 R2, storage spaces is really coming into the forefront. So one of the features that it lists here, which is automatic storage tiers, so being able to leverage SSD speed capabilities alongside the capacity that mechanical drives give, so that we can really get large amounts of storage that's also very fast. Now, finally moving on to the final of the feature sets here, which is around the remote access side. So we've got the Windows Essentials Experience capability, which has been rolled into standard and data center versions of Windows Server 2012 R2 if you want to enable them. If you're a large organization or you're dealing with large customers, you probably don't need to enable that, but for smaller organizations, it's definitely something that's worth taking a look at. Now, obviously, there are enhancements to the remote desktop services capabilities, and we'll come back and we'll talk about some of these additional features as we work through the additional demonstrations and product slides. So as we take a look at the scale enhancements of Windows Server 2012 R2, really the important things to note here is that we're really at a point with Windows Server where its capabilities are really ahead of the game in terms of what hardware can actually deliver today. So it gives it a lot of breathing room for future generations of server platforms to become available, and for Windows Server and for Hyper-V to keep scaling on those platforms. Now, what you'll see here is that Windows Server 2012 isn't listed, it's only Server 2012 R2. The reason for that is that Server 2012 R2 and just normal 2012 edition have got these same limitations in place. But let's just take a look at some of the important ones here that are of relevance, where some customers who are still thinking about using the Hyper-V platform of Server 2008 R2, just to give you an idea of why you may not want to be looking at that one when there are much better options available today. So first of all, if we take a look at the virtual processors per virtual machine, that's jumped from 4 up to 64. The memory per virtual machine has jumped from 64 gigabytes up to 1 terabyte. The virtual disk capacity has jumped from 2 terabytes to 64 terabytes. And the number of virtual machines, this is something that's also increased quite drastically if you are looking at doing some hosting and scaling up. And this has jumped from 1,000 to 8,000. So obviously we're talking about massive scale in that capability. But even when we take a look at things like the amount of physical memory that can be addressed by the server itself, we're going from 1 terabyte up to 4 terabytes. Now, what's important here is if we refer back to that previous slide where I said that Windows Server Standard has got the same capabilities as Windows Data Center Edition in Server 2012 R2, that means that these same limits also apply to Standard, not just to Data Center. So this is something that that has also been quite a change from the 2008 R2 days. So what are the system requirements for Windows Server 2012 R2? Well, really they're not all that high, and it's really the workload that you're going to be running on it that determines what these requirements are. So from the CPU side, the minimum that it will detect is a 1.4 gigahertz 64-bit CPU. So like Server 2008 R2, it does have to, and onwards, it has to be 64-bit only. If you do have a customer that needs to run a 32-bit version of Windows Server, the most recent version of that, and I guess for those of you thinking about post-Server 2003 support scenarios, you do need to look at obtaining Server 2008 installations in order to do that, because it did have a 32 and a 64-bit edition. Now, memory, this is one that really is going to be determined by the workloads that you're running. So the minimum is 512. In some cases, it can run in less than that if it's not doing very much. But if you're running things like Exchange or large databases, obviously 512 megabytes is not going to be enough for you. Now with the disk space, again, 32 gig is what the installation needs. And then from there, the other requirements, such as, gigabit adapter capabilities, a DVD drive if you do want to install from media, as well as if you are going to be hooking up to a display, at least 1024 by 768, for example, to make sure that you can go through and do setup properly. So if we take a look at some of the changes around server virtualization with Hyper-V, if we take a look at the top three IT demands here, support for demanding critical business workloads, increased flexibility to move resources and workloads, and leveraging existing cross-platform investments, this is really what Windows Server 2012 R2 has really aimed to deliver. So we're talking about enterprise scale, enterprise class scale and performance. So as you saw, we had huge improvements in scalability between 2008 R2 and the 2012 versions. We've got virtual machine mobility, so it introduced the concept of a shared nothing live migration scenario, which will be demonstrated during the product demonstrations, and other things such as flexible guest clustering options, as well as multi-node Hyper-V replicas, with you being able to control that replication frequency. Now, other things that's important to note when you are looking at tools like Hyper-V or its competitors is that Hyper-V isn't just for running Windows. So if you need to run Linux VMs, for example, you do have full support for a number of different Linux distributions. And this is something that does get updated on a regular basis. So it's always worth checking the support pages to see if the flavor of Linux you need to run is officially supported. So let's just quickly revisit the virtualization strategies with Windows Server 2012 R2. So if you do want to do extensive virtualization, then you can go through, and it's probably just easier to buy Data Center Edition right off the bat because it gives you an unlimited number of VMs per physical server. Now, the other option, though, is that you can just keep buying additional copies of Standard Edition and adding them to the existing server. So this is something that may sound like a great idea to begin with, but you'll probably find that it's not going to take long until buying Data Center probably made more sense to begin with. So it's always worth taking a really close look at how many VMs maximum any server is going to be expected to run, based on the patch management solutions, based on server down scenarios, to make sure that data center licensing is taken into account for those scenarios, because generally it works out to be quite a few less VMs per server than some people may anticipate. So one of the big changes that's been happening over the years is customers are looking at different options around how they purchase products, how they license products. And one of the things that a lot of people don't realize is that software assurance, even though generally people associate it with buying through open, is that it can also be applied to OEM product. Now, we're not going to go through all of the options here in terms of what's included with software assurance, because this is something that's dynamic. It's changed over the years to keep adding more and more programmatic benefits rather than it just being about the product versions. But let's take a look at this from an OEM perspective. So you can add software assurance to an OEM Windows Server license. It needs to be purchased within 90 days of the original OEM license purchase, and what happens here is that the OEM software then inherits the Microsoft product usage rights instead of the end user license agreement rights. So that means that effectively you're ending up with something that has got more flexibility. So what does this really mean? Well, if it's something you need more details on in terms of pricing and part numbers, for example, if you talk to your distributors, so at this point in time, all of the open distributors are also OEM distributors for Microsoft. So call up one of your distributors and they'll be able to go through this in more detail. So what are some of the benefits if you do apply software assurance to OEM software? Well, first of all, you can reassign the license to new hardware. So if we think about the OEM license, it's all about living and dying with that piece of hardware, and that doesn't apply anymore. So that means that if the customer does need to upgrade the hardware, they don't necessarily have to upgrade the server software because they've got software assurance. So it means that if they need to move to more capable hardware in terms of more power, or new hardware that's got new capability, so it might be hardware that's got new virtualization technologies that really allows their software to perform better. So it allows customers to extend their current investment in software by moving it to new technologies as they become available. Now, it also gives you access to new product versions. So at this point in time, we are in the middle of the year 2015. So what's important here is that Microsoft's already publicly talking about the next version of Windows Server. There's a lot of information out there already. So what if that's got some capabilities that you're looking at, thinking, I've got customers who could really benefit from some of this, but they need to start migrating now? Well, if you apply software assurance to the OEM purchase, and that OEM purchase can include pre-install, it includes ROK, it includes the channel OEM product you can buy through a distributor, you can sell that to the customer now, apply software assurance, and then when they're ready to deploy the new capabilities that a new version of Windows Server provides, they've got the rights to do so. So for customers, it means they can get more predictability in terms of the costs. It means that the costs can be lower than buying a new version. It also means that from your perspective, you can start planning out software upgrades for customers if you know they've got software assurance, and if you know there are features coming that are going to be very useful to them. This is something you can start having discussions with your customers about much earlier on in the game, and it doesn't have to then include the additional software sales component of that conversation. So now, finally, just moving on to the final section of this recording, which is Windows Server 2012 R2 Essentials. So a few of the things that we've spoken about so far when we've spoken about some of these technologies may have been seeming to target larger organizations. So let's just finish off focusing on something that is quite SMB focused, which is the Essentials capabilities. So if we take a look at the three key areas that Essentials tends to target, we're talking about data protection capabilities through things like simplified backups, client PC backups, disaster recovery capabilities. The backup software integrates with the Azure online backup services, so just making sure that you can back up on-prem as well as to the cloud. It also brings forward the remote web access or remote web workplace, depending on what version of SBS you're used to. It also brings those tools and technologies into the Server 2012 R2 world. So if you do have customers that use those technologies, these are things that they can still use to remotely access their network through things like the web browser or VPN connectivity, and it still makes it very simple. Now, perhaps the jewel in the crown of the Essentials product is the Microsoft Online Services cloud integration capabilities, which will integrate with Microsoft Office 365. It will integrate with Microsoft Azure as well as Microsoft Intune, so that you can really start very easily, adding new users on-prem and then having those users then automatically, or you can select what Office 365 facilities you want them to have. If you've got other things that you want them to get access to that are based on Microsoft Online Services, you can also then just start enabling those directly within this console. So this simplifies things. It means you don't have to jump in and start learning PowerShell each time you've got to add new users. It means that you don't have to jump into multiple portals each time you need to add licenses or change licenses for users. So it ends up giving you a much more seamless cloud integrated experience than what you've been able to get in the past through Windows Server on its own. So what's also changed this time round is that the Server Essentials capabilities are now also a role that can be enabled inside of Windows Server 2012 R2 Standard or Data Center Edition. So that means that it's not just for up to 25 users. There are new capabilities included now in Standard and Data Center that allow you to scale this up to 100 users and 200 devices. Now there are also a variety of different scenarios in which you can deploy multiple servers inside of an organization that's large enough. And this is something that I've covered in more detail in the blog site. So make sure you check out the Oz OEM team blog site on TechNet, and there should be links alongside this presentation to make that easier for you to find. But this is just a role that you can go through and you can enable it very, very simply. And then if you do outgrow those capabilities, you can then uninstall the role and then those features are removed. Now, just taking a quick look at how this works, this means that if we take the example here that if we've got this diagram and we're using Standard Edition, it means we can either use just a Hyper-V server installation or a Windows Server Core installation or just a basic Windows Server installation itself. We can enable the Hyper-V role inside of that. Then we can run the two standard VMs that we're licensed to run. One of them we can install the Windows Server Essentials role, and then on that second VM we can install whatever else it is that we need. So if we need to install Exchange Server, if we need to install SQL or another line of business application, if we need to enable remote desktop services, that's the kind of thing that we can do on that second VM, and then we still get that integration into the online services that we do need access to. So overall it gives us a very, very nice solution for in this case, organizations of up to 100 users or 200 devices. So that's really it for the presentation portion of this. So what you'll also find accompanying this presentation are a series of videos that show some of the technologies that we've spoken about in a walkthrough approach, so you can actually see things working end to end. So please take a look at the links accompanying this video and you'll be able to take a look at those ones as well. So thank you for your time.